Dr. Adesina, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you for the first time on an edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Well, thank you very much, Shaka. I've heard great things about you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you, I gather that this is the first time that you have actually attended the spring conference of the World Bank and the IMF as a voice, as an economic voice of Africa. Tell us, what was the experience like?
Well, you know, it's great for me to be here. It's my first spring meeting, as you rightly said, as president of the African Development Bank. It's been fantastic. We discussed a range of issues. I think not least of them was the economic headwinds that African countries face and what those implications mean for Africa. And my position is that you take a look at Africa today, African economies are growing at, average of 4.4% in terms of GDP growth rates, and the global economy is growing at 3.3%. It's been re-evaluated down to 3.2% by IMF. Europe is growing at 1.9%. So Africa is actually doing reasonably quite well in very tough times. And, it's like swimming in water. You keep your head above water. I think Africa's head is above water. I think the message for me is that Africa is not unraveling by any chance. I think African economies have shown tremendous amount of resilience. So in tough times, Africa is still doing very well. And even the 4.4% that we all talk about, we forget that East Africa, for example, is growing at 6.5%. So Africa continues to be the place to invest. I think we discussed quite a lot about that. I feel that the message is clear that Africa is still the place to invest in.
What about the falling prices in terms of commodities, and we're talking about oil and gas?
Well, obviously, for the last 10 years, Africa has witnessed tremendous amount of growth on the back of commodity super cycle that we have had, and largely because of the growth in China. 85%, however, of the exports of Africa to China happens to be, primary commodities, whether it's minerals, metals, agricultural products. And these tend to have cyclical behavior, and you have all these volatilities. Yes, they have been affected. Some countries more hard hit than others. You look at those that export oil, for example, big ones like Nigeria or Angola have been very badly hit. Zambia, copper has been badly hit, and South Africa, and also Algeria and other countries. But that's not everything. I think you have those that are net importers of oil that also benefit, so you have an equilibration that actually goes on. Well, for me, the thing that comes out of this is first and foremost another lesson that we must learn again, which is that African economies absolutely have to diversify, diversify, and diversify fast, and also to not just diversify in terms of the export markets, but also diversify in terms of your product mix as well. Non-traditional oil exports are very important. We have a lot of minerals, and we have a lot of those things that we should be actually getting into agricultural products, in which we have huge amount of comparative advantage. But I also think it's another reminder of the importance for Africa to grow its own regional market, because the countries that actually export into wider regional markets are always less susceptible to global commodity price volatilities. I think that's another thing that we must do. As you know, in Africa today, only 11% of trade, intra-regional trade, happens between us. And I think we should have an Africa without borders. I think we should have an Africa where we can trade among ourselves. And this is critical to the work that we do at the African Development Bank. But even if you take a look, Shaka, at the situation with China today, China has to externalize a lot of its excess industrial capacity. It has to go somewhere. Most of that, in my view, has to come to Africa, because the industrial wage rate in Africa is, for skilled labor, is 28% of what it is in China. And the unskilled labor wage rate is 18% of what it is in China. So Africa should be the place to receive this. But that can't happen unless we can light up and power Africa, which is one of the topmost priorities I have set for the bank, is that we must absolutely have electricity to do that. So in any way, all I'm saying is that the projections do show that Africa will recover to about 5.2, 5.3%, 2017, 2018. So Africa will continue to be on an upswing, but I think we have to address structural issues, which is really get into agriculture that allows us to have inclusive growth and also deepen our work in investment in electricity, because without power you have nothing.
Talking about agriculture, I gather that you are a son of a farmer.
Yeah.
You are, in fact, a legitimate farmer yourself. You studied agricultural economics.
Yes.
There was a time when your great country, Nigeria, was food self-sufficient. In fact, not only did it feed itself, it could even afford to export to other parts of the world. What happened?
Well,
and how can you turn it around?
You know, Shaka, is a classic thing that you see all across Africa. For me, I take a look at the situation. It's not acceptable that a continent that has 65% of all the arable land left in the world to feed 9 billion people by 2050 is not able to feed itself. It just doesn't make any sense. We have a lot of water, a lot of land, a lot of great sunshine, you know, and great hard-working people. You throw up any seed before it hits the ground, literally it can grow anywhere in Africa. So I believe African countries should actually focus on agriculture, and Africa should be a global powerhouse in food and agriculture. You know, but what tends to happen is that, you know, the classic Dutch disease, and people find oil, you know, oil is, you don't do anything, you just scoop it, and so it's easier to do. And as that happens, you know, exchange rate appreciates, and therefore it becomes uncompetitive for agricultural sector now to grow. Now, I think when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, before I became President of the African Development Bank, you know, I took a position that we had to move away from just depending on oil to actually looking at the riches under our soil, the soil wealth itself, and that is in agriculture. But we have to start taking agriculture as a business, not as a way of life, and that's what we did. You know, we had huge amount of success in the 4 years that I was there as Minister of Agriculture. You know, we were able to significantly expand the area under rice cultivation. We reached over 6 million farmers with improved rice technology. We, you know, achieved, you know, about, you know, we moved from about 35% self-sufficiency in paddy rice production to about 80-85% within 4 years. You know, it tells you that it can happen. We cut our food import bill right down from about $6 billion to about, you know, $2.5 billion in 4 years. And so it tells you that these things can happen fast. We all have to change our perspective on agriculture. You know, my view is that whether it's from Uganda to Tanzania to Kenya to Ethiopia to Senegal to Nigeria to Ghana, you know, we all have vast amount of opportunities. But that is why, as President of the African Development Bank, I took the position that we're going to have some priorities, you know, and we set 5 priorities for ourselves at the bank, you know, and at the top of that priority is energy to light up and power Africa. Second one is to feed Africa, and hence the point on agriculture. And on that one, what we really want to do is to allow African countries to unlock the potential of their agricultural sector. Because obviously potential is important, but you can't eat potential. So you got to unlock that potential. And we want African countries to become self-sufficient in food production in 10 years, and to not only produce, but also add value to everything that you produce. So you take a look at it today, you know, yes, we produce so much cocoa. You know, Africa accounts today for 75% of all the cocoa production in the world for chocolates that you and I like. But Africa only has 2% of the market for chocolate, which is $100 billion a year. So we are at the bottom of the value chain, not at the top of the value chain. So within the African Development Bank, we're going to invest heavily in agriculture, but as a business, for agro-allied industrialization, to allow Africa to be competitive, not only in regional markets, but also in global markets. For me, the future of Africa lies in what we do with agriculture. I've always said it, that the future millionaires or billionaires of Africa will not come from the oil and gas industry. They'll come from the agricultural sector.
When you talk about adding value to agricultural products, it obviously sounds very interesting. People have been talking the talk, but nobody has yet walked that talk. Why is that so? Look at cocoa, for example. When I was a kid growing up in Uganda, I read about the cocoa capital of the world being Ghana, Nigeria. And today you talk about the Ivory Coast. Any particular reason, frankly, why those countries are not in the forefront of adding value, at least producing chocolate and what have you?
Well, you know what happened is the lenses with which we look at agriculture and the mindset influences every single decision we make. You know, because we all came from rural backgrounds and everybody was coming out of agricultural sector, running to the cities, everybody wanted white-collar jobs and so on. And because of the high level of rural poverty, everybody just said, forget agriculture. Nobody wants to go into that sector. So you have that negative thing about agriculture. And as a result, we look at the sector as a way in which we, let me say, manage poverty or maintain poverty, not as a sector in which you clearly have to mobilize a lot of resources. I mean, if you have 70% of your labor force in a given sector, and as a Minister of Finance, you can't use fiscal policies to even tax the sector in any way, that tells you have a problem. You know, how can it be that Africa, that has most of the land in the world, has a lot of farmers that are asking for food aid? It just can't happen. So I think what has really happened now is we have to take agriculture as a business and therefore focus on agriculture as a private sector driven sector. You know, government can provide the enabling environment, but actually the private sector that drives this. I'll tell you something. We're changing that at the African Development Bank since I got there. Within the first 2 weeks of my starting as president of the bank, I called a meeting, high-level meeting in Dakar, of all the ministers of finance, the ministers of agriculture, and central bank governors. Just think about it, to talk about what? Agriculture. And I helped them to understand that agriculture is not some sector you leave to the Minister of Agriculture. Agriculture is central to how you have inclusive growth and also central to how you have macroeconomic and fiscal stabilization. I explained to the central bank governors that, look, your monetary policy will be a lot helped if you actually were able to reduce inflation by actually producing a lot of food, right? All of you do is you try to drive inflation down. Well, 75, almost 65% of your consumer price index is actually food. So if you can drive the price of food down, you have better macroeconomic stability. So the point I'm making is that the narrative has changed. Now Africa needs to diversify. It needs to diversify into agriculture. It needs to now process and add value to everything that it produces. Every time I travel to Europe, obviously like the rest, every one of us will buy some chocolate. So I used to normally go to chocolateries, you know, some of these factories. And I went to one and right in front of it, it says, we've been producing chocolate since 1863.
Really?
Yeah. and they explained to me everything. And then the gentleman asked me, what do you think from your impression of what you've seen here? What do you think? I said, well, what I see here is that Africa has been doing a dumb thing since 1863, exporting raw cocoa without adding value to anything. So no, that has to change. Whether it is rice, whether it's cassava, whether it is beans, whether it is soya beans, whatever Africa produces, Africa must add value to it. You are from Uganda.
Correct.
Right. And Uganda is known for its bananas, right?
Yes.
Matoke and
Correct,
all of that.
matoke.
But you can do a lot with bananas. Banana for flour, you know, banana is the base for baby foods. You know, banana can be used in terms of starch. You know, banana wine is actually very, very good wine. It's a whole range of products that we must do. So we must recognize that if you take agriculture today, Africa spends $35 billion a year importing food, which it should not be importing, right? If we don't change anything, by 2030, Africa will be spending $110 billion importing food. That is food Africa should be producing, processing, right, and being competitive in the market for. So I think that agriculture in Africa must be taken as a business.
You know, Dr. Adesina, it is ironic. You hear, for example, about English tea. And yet, the last time I checked, frankly, the British do not, in fact, grow any tea. You don't hear about Ugandan tea. You don't hear about Kenyan tea. Why? How can we go about promoting our agricultural products and market them to the degree that they deserve?
Well, you know, Africa has been doing actually quite well in some areas, and I think the tea sector and the coffee sector, a lot of, you know, branding has begun, you know, in this particular area. I think Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya are branding a lot of their products going to the market. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But that's why you need to set up agro-allied industries, right? A lot of processing, adding value, packaging and marketing is what goes into agricultural products. And so I think everybody's beginning to understand that better now. I mean, take the case of Ethiopia. Ethiopia went not too long ago into floriculture market, and today they are number 2 in Africa in that market after Kenya. And Kenya has done tremendously well with regard to its horticulture sector. You look at Ghana has done quite well also in terms of its export of pineapples and all of that. No, I think the basic point is that when you begin to get our rich people to understand that the new wealth sector is the agriculture sector, they move into it. When I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, I remember a conversation I had with Aliko Dangote, the richest black man
African
in the world.
man.
Yeah. He came into my office and he said, well, Minister, I'm excited your policies are working, so I want to change my business model. I said, from what? He said, from being an importer to being a producer. And he said he was going to put in $300 million into commercial production of rice in Nigeria. Obviously, I got excited as Minister of Agriculture. Well, he came back 3 months later, and he said, I've changed my mind. I said, what happened? What did I do wrong? He said, no, I changed my mind from $300 million to investing, I'm going to invest $1 billion in commercial rice production with outgrower schemes of farmers. That's what I'm saying. When Africa's rich people begin to recognize that Africa's future lies in what we do with producing and adding value to this rich stock of resources we have, I think then we begin to make a lot of progress.
In fact, I recently saw you on television. You were in Abidjan. You were on the same panel with Aliko Dangote himself, and you were talking about agro-business, how you want to transform farmers into, in fact, looking at agriculture as a business. Let's talk about energy. You obviously have more than 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity. How are you going to come up with the miracle of making sure that these people have unfettered access to that aspect of energy? Are you going to collaborate, for example, with President Barack Obama's Power Africa? Are you going to be collaborating with people like your compatriot Tony Erumeru?
Well, I mean, when you take a look at the problem, it's actually quite sad, and for me as an African, extremely embarrassing, that 138 years after Thomas Edison developed the light bulb, we can't light it. Makes no sense. Today you have 645 million Africans that don't have access to electricity. The kids can't go to school and learn. 90% of the schools in Africa, primary schools, over 95% don't have electricity. And you look at the number of secondary schools that don't have electricity, right? Kids can't learn in the dark. We're trying to do business, but trying to do business in the dark. It makes actually the whole issue of terrorism even more difficult because, bad guys operate in dark places, right? Because we can't light up Africa.
But
right?
business can't work that way.
Businesses can't work that way. Today, Africa loses roughly 5% of the GDP annually because of lack of electricity, because small and medium-sized businesses can't function. Vaccines in hospitals can't work. No, so we've got to also recognize that, period. Africa is simply tired of being in the dark, right? The lack of electricity in Africa is the greatest drag on our development. I mean, a continent as big as ours produces the same amount of electricity as Belgium, right, or Spain, right?
10 million people.
Just 10 million people, you can imagine. And so it doesn't make any sense. But when you take a look at the amount of resources that we have, it's tremendous. And we have so much sunshine that, literally it's almost limitless. We can have 11 terawatts of energy out of solar. If you take a look at a hydro, right, huge amount of hydro potential, about 350 gigawatts of potential for hydro. And you look at the whole issue of wind, you're talking about another 150 gigawatts potential for wind. And in East Africa area, you have a lot of geothermal potential, probably another 15 gigawatts of potential. Not to talk of the fact that we have natural gas being flared into the air, like in Nigeria and other places, you know, and you also have access to coal, which is, you know, all across South Africa, Botswana, every other place. So literally, Shaka, Africa has no business.
And South Africa, of course, has access to nuclear.
Nuclear, you know, for being in the dark. So what we've done is, I've said our priority in Africa is to help to light up and power Africa, and to do that within 10 years. And to do that, we require that we have a new conversation about energy. That's why the bank launched, the African Development Bank launched what we call the New Deal on Energy for Africa. Under that New Deal for Energy for Africa, we're hoping to connect 160 million people.
How are you going to fund it?
Well, there are various ways in which you can fund this. Let me say that the deficit in terms of financing energy in Africa today, it's about $65–70 billion, right? Now, how can you fund that? First and foremost, let's take a look at how much the countries themselves put into the energy sector. On average, African countries put in 0.1% of their GDP.
What?
Yes, into the energy sector. And so, no surprises there that you don't have electricity. But if you increase that from 0.1% to 3.4% of the GDP, that will make available every year at least $54–55 billion. That will go a long way in solving the problem. If you take a look at the amount of resources we have in terms of taxes, right? Africa today generates about $500 billion in taxes every year. We're doing quite well in terms of, you know, taxes now. If you just take 10% of that, and you dedicate it to the energy sector, problem is almost going to be solved. Then you take a look also at what's going to happen with regard to the amount of money we have sitting out there in our pension funds. Today, Africa has, you know, about $334 billion in its pension funds. You know, you look at sovereign wealth funds, $164 billion. Private equity funds, $20 billion. We've just got to get clever at leveraging this huge amount of resources into the energy sector. As the African Development Bank, the ways in which we're going to do that is we're going to invest $12 billion over the next 5 years in the energy sector. And part of that will be used to leverage $45–50 billion from the private sector by using partial risk guarantees, partial credit guarantees, and helping to de-risk the investments of the private sector into this space. So we have a lot of partners we're working with. We launched this thing called Transformative Partnership on Energy. I'm excited by what President Obama did. In fact, I am very proud of him for what he did for Africa and what he's doing with the Electrify Africa Act that was passed by the Congress, and also the Power Africa initiative. So we're working closely together with Power Africa, working with the Brits on the solar work, working also with Sustainable Energy for All of the United Nations. So this Transformative Partnership on Energy is a new platform of engagement where we all say, well, look, let's raise our level of aspiration for electricity for Africa. Let's mobilize the resources from public and private sector, but also let's interface with the governments to increase their own level of financing going into this sector, as well as increasing also the efficiency of use of those resources, and particularly, you know, if you go to almost all the countries in Africa, the energy sector is not, you know, the energy is not priced properly. And so somebody wants to bring in investment, but the tariff structure is such that you are giving energy below the cost of production. So that doesn't help you. So one of the things we are going to do is to work with African governments for the necessary reforms of the energy sector to make it more attractive. We did that for the telecoms industry, and look at what it is today with mobile phones all across Africa. So I think the time is right to do it. I think the political will is there. I'm excited as I talk to African heads of state all across. Everybody's woken up to it. We must light up and power Africa because, as I said, literally, it's holding Africa back, and we can't continue that way.
Let's talk about drought in Southern Africa. I gather, in fact, that you were recently in Southern Africa. How is the African Development Bank responding to that catastrophe?
You know, it's when you take a look at the situation with climate change, Africa today just contributes what, 2%? to the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, but we suffer disproportionately from the negative impact of the climate change. For us, the impact of climate change is not in the future. No, it's now. It's right here and now. When I went on the trip that you saw to South Africa just last week, I went to Malawi, and I was in Mozambique, but also in South Africa. And while I was in Malawi, I it was almost like a diplomatic, security thing. When in the convoy going to the airport, and I saw all these farms that were brown, and I just asked the convoy to stop. As somebody who grew up on the farm, somebody who knows agriculture, I know that it means that livelihoods have already been destroyed. So I got out of the car, ran to the fields, and I started looking at the maize cobs that are there. And, I took these maize cobs, and they're like this. Malawi today has 8.4 million people that are food insecure as a result of the El Nino drought problem.
Wow.
Last year, because they had flood, it was 2.8 million. But look at them today, 8.4 million people that were food insecure. Now, what's the bank doing? Immediately, I announced that the bank, the African Development Bank, will make available $549 million, to support countries to be able to adjust to this quickly.
Is that a loan or a grant?
No, it is basically emergency support operations for them to be able to do it. And the other one is we reprogram a lot of our monies to be able to give them direct budget support to be able to cope with the huge amount of people that are now food insecure. Look at Ethiopia, that's 10.5 million people. So that's what we're doing as the bank. But in addition to that, because these things are always going to happen, extreme weather patterns, right? I put forward here, even at the annual meetings of the spring meetings here of the World Bank, and I discussed it with the UN Secretary General actually also yesterday, that the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility should actually help to pay for African countries to pay for the premiums for them to join what is called the Africa Risk Capacity. The Africa Risk Capacity is a new institution that allows governments to, it insures you against catastrophic risks. So if you have, like in drought today, you have rapidly paying funds into your public budget that can allow you to cope with the issue. But the problem is who pays for the premium. So we're making the case for that. As the African Development Bank, we are also going to support a lot of climate resilient agriculture. We are also going to look at how to support significant amount of crop insurance for many farmers. And in terms of climate finance, I've said that we'll triple our climate finance to $5 billion a year by 2020. So we all have to help Africa to do a lot to adapt to the negative impacts of climate change, and we just have to focus on that.
As you know, President Adesina, the majority of the African population today is made up of very young people. A lot of these young people do not have skills, frankly, to help them earn a living. I guess that you have at the bank a project in place. Can you talk about it?
Yes, one of our top priorities is improving the quality of life of the people of Africa. And under that particular initiative, obviously we have to look at how we build the workforce of the future, because we're in a knowledge-based economy increasingly, right? And so we need people that are very well skilled, but also people that have the entrepreneurship capacity to help Africa grow. Now, I am so worried about the situation of unemployment on the continent among the youth. I went to, just about a few days before I started as president of the bank, I went to Gore in Senegal, where they took a lot of the slaves and all of that. And it was a very emotional time for me. I stood at this door, which they call the door of no return. And so when all the slaves have been put into the boats, then that's it. You don't go back. And as I left that place, I went back into my car and reflecting about what I had just gone through. And it occurred to me, I said, well, at that time, the slaves were taken here and thrown on boats against their will. But today, you got young people that jump on rickety boats willingly to go on the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, many die in the process, going to Europe. Now, they're fleeing because the nature of the growth process in Africa has not been inclusive enough. We've not been able to really get our young people to get jobs. And so we are launching at the bank what's called Jobs for Africa's Youth Initiative. This initiative, Shaka, is designed to create 25 million jobs for young people within 10 years. It's going to focus a lot on building their skills. There's going to be rural youth looking at agriculture. There are going to be graduates that are looking at different parts of the value chains in agriculture. There's going to be a lot of focus on ICT, capacity building. There's going to be a lot also on small and medium-sized enterprises of young people, and also creating a fund that allows the business of young people on the continent to thrive. You know, I don't believe the future of Africa's young people lies in migrating out of Africa. I think we ought to build a more robust, a much more inclusive growth process in Africa that allows us to turn our demographic asset into an economic dividend for our young people. And I'm quite excited already with what we are seeing. We have an initiative, for example, that is called Enable Youth in Agriculture, that are getting doctors and lawyers and architects, young people that go into agriculture as a business. When I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, I started something called agropreneurs, which is a way of getting young people into agriculture as a business. You know, and I wore my bow ties all the time as a Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, basically because I wanted the young people to understand that agriculture is a wealth-creating sector. It's not what you thought about. You know, I mean, after all, the biggest business in the world is the food business.
How did they respond?
Oh, fantastically well. In fact, I'll tell you, today if you go to Nigeria, you see a lot of young people, they call themselves Nagropreneurs. They're called Nigerian agricultural entrepreneurs. They are doctors, they are lawyers, they are architects, they are all in agriculture. And in fact, one of them, I'm so proud of her, you know, Awa Bello, you know, she's a lawyer, and she got a grant. We gave grants to these young people to build their businesses. And, you know, 18 months after, she was invited by the London Fashion Week to come and show her bags, because she went into production of bags from our own local tannery that she had put together. You know, just 2 months ago, she was featured on CNN. You know, and just tells you how fast this can happen. There are young people that are going into commercial production of rice for dairy products and so on. So I think everybody's just coming alive to realize that it's a big amount of money to be made in agriculture. So it's not what you used to think about. It's a very, let me say, pretty cool sector. So yes, the Jobs Initiative for Africa, it's our way of doing that. And one more point I want to raise on that is that you raised something importantly about the lack of connection between the skills that they have and what the labor market needs, right? And one of the things we're going to help African countries to do is to develop what we call skills enhancement zones. And these are growth special economic zones where, as kids come out of universities and polytechnics, they go through these zones that have different types of industries. They get exposed to skills across multiple sets of industries. So after 5-6 months, their skills are better enhanced, they are employable in the labor market, and they can have a labor market entry. So we think that this is very, very crucial, and the African Development Bank is taking the lead in this, and we really think that it is important to keep African youth, the future of our countries, and of our continent, working but thriving on the continent.
On a personal note, how is it like to be the president of the African Development Bank? Can you walk us through a day in the life of Dr. Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank?
Well, you know, as president of the African Development Bank, I don't think I have a job. It's not a job for me at all.
Why?
It's a mission.
It is a mission.
It's a mission because I hear the voices of the kids that need to go to school. I hear the voices of the farmers that are locked in poverty that need to come out of it. I hear the voices of poor households that needs to send their girls to school, but they're spending 10 hours, the girls going to look for water, you know, and therefore they miss out school. You know, you look at a situation where a continent has, you know, 58 million kids that are stunted. Now, those are the things that drive me. It's a mission for me. It's not a job. right? And so every single day that I wake up to my job and my colleagues is to ask myself the question, how can we help better? How can we deliver faster, better, and at scale with others? My day starts always about how do we find solutions to the crippling problems that bother us every
Like what time do you wake up, for example?
Oh, I wake up very, very early, and I always wake up early to pray as well, because it's not something you can do always with your physical strength. But not only prayer for myself, but prayer for my colleagues and partners and all the others that we're working with. And you come to work, you basically talk quite a lot to countries, heads of state. You're motivating, you're working and motivating at the same time. So I think the life of a president of African Development Bank is one in which there's a lot of high expectations. And Africans should have high expectations. And my view is we must never set low aspirations for Africa. We've got to set high aspirations for Africa and work our butts off to actually make sure we can deliver on that. And so I'm proud of my colleagues. I'm proud of the partners that we have around the world. I'm proud of the investors in the bank. I'm here in the United States. I just had fantastic discussions with the U.S. Treasury Department here about what we are doing together with the U.S. government. And I'm grateful for the support of the bank. And I just think that the bank is key for how Africa goes forward.
If you were to talk to us from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Nigerian heart and soul, what is it that you need to do, that you must do, in order for you to consider yourself a success?
I think over the next 10 years, we absolutely have to light up and empower Africa. People are talking about fourth industrial revolution today, but we're not even in the first one, just because we don't have access to electricity. So electricity for Africa, universal, is key. Second is that I think Africa, it's just about time for Africa to actually fully feed itself, and I think that can be done in 10 years. And when I'm retired, and I can sit on the couch, on the couch somewhere, and I look out of the window, if I know that we have more kids that have been to school, we've been able to provide a lot of water and sanitation, decent housing for people. We've been able to create a lot of jobs for young people. And we have an Africa that is lit up and able to feed itself. I can rest well.
What would you say so far has been the single most important decision that you have made? And what about the single most regrettable decision during your presidency?
Well, I think the most important decision that I have made is to get the bank to focus on what it can deliver on. And those are the high fives. We've done a lot of work over the last couple of months that I've been there. I've only been there now for almost 7 months, but it looks like I've been there for over 2 years. That is focus so that we can be held more accountable and work better with others. And so that is light up and empower Africa, feed Africa, integrate Africa, industrialize Africa, and improve the quality of life for the people of Africa. We call them high fives. So that the things we've been able to brand ourselves for, that we are going to be held accountable for. And that's going very, very well. We have a lot of support behind us for that. Now, in terms of I don't have any regrets. I think I actually have a lot more excitement.
What about lessons learned so far?
Well, the lessons that we've learned so far is that to solve a lot of challenges in Africa requires more than the African Development Bank. I don't want the bank that follows. I want the African Development Bank to lead because we are set up to do that. But we have to work with others. And my way of working is what I always call co-development. Working with others to be able to work on big problems and to be able to deliver faster for Africa. So I think that's the nature of working. And one of the things that I'm learning is that development, for it to happen, you need to have political will. And so I spend a lot of time with African heads of state, encouraging and supporting them, and also challenging them in terms of what needs to be done. So I think it's a pretty exciting work, but one for which I know that the weights are high, are big on my shoulders, and I know what we have to do.
The bank has been around for more than 50 years. How do you think it has fared so far? more than 50 years, since 1964.
Yeah. No, the bank has done very well. I think if you take a look at the bank, the shareholding of the bank is very strong. We've always maintained a AAA rating. Even last year, in December, all the rating agencies confirmed the AAA rating of the bank. Our shareholding capacity is very, very strong. And the developmental impact that the bank has done is huge. I mean, if you take a look at some of the things we've done, you from Uganda, you look at the Northern Corridor that we've invested heavily on. We've done a lot in terms of rail and ports, in terms of roads, in terms of interconnectivity, in terms of transmission lines between countries, which is very, very important. We've invested a lot in water and sanitation over time, impacting tens of millions of people. And the bank is a trusted partner by African countries. If there's an issue that comes up in Africa, the first place of call for the presidents is actually the African Development Bank, because they know that we're quite responsive to them. We understand their needs better. We will provide the kind of support that's necessary, but we also ask the hard questions with a nice smile as well, because it's your bank. As an African heads of state. So yes, the bank is doing a lot. We are now in a phase where we have to raise new financing for what we call the African Development Fund. Because we have the African Development Bank, African Development Fund, and the Nigerian Trust Fund. That makes the bank's group. And so the replenishment phase is where we are now, and we think that it's important to have a very solid replenishment. And I had very good discussions here at the Hill and also with U.S. Treasury Department. I think we're on the right track.
There was this great British imperialist called Sir John Cecil Rhodes. He had a dream of a road that would link Cape Town to Cairo. Is that a possibility under the African Development Bank? Because can you imagine, in fact, what it could do to open up all these markets?
We are doing exactly that right now. We're investing in that road. All the presidents in Africa have what they call presidential infrastructure initiatives that they are championing. And the one from Cape to Cairo is being championed also by the president of South Africa, President Zuma.
Interesting.
And President Buhari has his own projects to link other parts of Africa. President Rwanda has. So basically, we believe that the most important thing for Africa is to be well integrated. Right? And that requires a lot of infrastructure. We have 54 countries, but you have a lot of landlocked countries.
Correct.
And you have those that have ports. So one thing that the bank has done very well is to invest in transnational highways, to invest more in ports, strategic ports, but also to invest in fiber optics that allow you to have internet connectivity across African countries. Infrastructure is the key. And I've said that as an African, I want to be able to have free labor mobility all across Africa. That way you can have a lawyer here that can work in a different country and without visas. And the African Development Bank has also produced a visa index for Africa, where you see that today, unfortunately, an African needs to get visa in 75% of countries.
Dangote, in fact, was complaining about that.
He was complaining about that. You can imagine if your richest man in Africa can't get a visa to go into a country. No, I think we need to recognize that Africa's future is not outside of Africa. Africa's future is right in Africa. You have a rapidly growing population, massive amount of urbanization, rapidly rising middle class. What we need to do is to bring the walls down. I remember when when they had President Reagan, went to Moscow at the time, and he said, President Gorbachev, bring down these walls.
Tear
these walls down. That's exactly what we're saying right now. And I think African Union is doing a fantastic job. I think Madam Zuma is doing a terrific job there, to open up Africa so that we can have a free continental trade area. That way, goods and services can move across our countries. We are much better integrated, right? We can increase the share of intra-regional trade from 12%, where we have today, to probably about 35–40%, where I think that's where we need to be.
I have two questions which were submitted by one of our interns from West Africa, Samose Diaro. He asks, how do you measure the impact of the ADB policies and what makes the ADB different from the World Bank?
Well, good question. You know, in measuring the impact of the work of the bank, you have to realize that our work is in three ways. First, we give a lot of loans, we give grants, and we give a lot of guarantees to countries. So you look at the size of funds that we actually give to countries. Last year, for example, you know, we gave $9 billion and $2.2 billion of that actually went to the private sector. So it's the extent to which we are able to mobilize capital to help countries. And how do we do that? It's important to see that is that we use our preferential status, right, because of our big capital shareholding, to be able to raise money off the capital markets at cheap rates. And then we on-lend that to countries. So when we lend to countries, we lend to them all that money at 0.6% interest rate. You can imagine.
I see.
And for a period of 40 years. So I think that's one way in which we do. What makes us different from the World Bank? First, we are African Development Bank. We were created to help to accelerate the development of Africa. And I think you'll find out that African countries see us as their bank. And because we understand the context very well, we work very closely with them. But of course, we work very closely with the World Bank, as well with IMF and all the others. But we're primarily an African Development Bank who must carry on his shoulders the hopes and aspirations of a continent.
But isn't it also largely dominated internally by Nigeria?
No, actually.
You have the Nigeria Trust Fund, for example.
No.
You have a majority of shares?
No, actually, the way the bank is structured is different. The bank actually shareholding is much more heterogeneous than that. We have the African Development Fund Bank, which has share capitalization from all African countries and then non-regional member countries. You also have the African Development Fund, which is largely non-regional. A few African countries are also there. The Nigerian Trust Fund.
Where the United Kingdom has majority shares?
Yes. And I think that.
And the US follows?
Yes.
Japan?
Yes. And I think that's good in the sense that it shows the confidence that everybody has in Africa and the shared responsibility that people have in working with Africa to move forward. But at the end of the day, it's an African Development Bank. We have to set the pace in terms of what the policies.
Right.
What Africa needs are, and what we need help to be, areas we need help so that we can support Africans better. The voice of Africa is so crucial in how things get done.
It's very interesting. You are the eighth president of the African Development Bank and the first from Nigeria. It's interesting because you had a Professor Adedeji, for example, for a long time who loomed large in as far as economic development was concerned on the continent. Does it surprise you that it took this long to get a Nigerian to be president of the African Development Bank? And that man is President Adesina.
Well, I'm generally not somebody who, I'm proud of being a Nigerian, but I've lived and worked in more than 15 African countries. I see
15?
Yes.
Wow.
I see myself as, including your country, Uganda.
Really?
Yeah.
For how long?
I was in Rockefeller Foundation for 10 years.
So you
and
were
we
able
did
to
quite a
move
lot
around.
of work in Uganda and Lamulonge
Station. Yes. Is that when you were based in Harare?
No, I was actually based in Nairobi, Kenya at the time. Yeah,
you had a good time, man.
Yeah, but you see, the thing there is that when you take a look at Africa, we have to start seeing ourselves as Africans. Countries are where we are born.
I like the idea of removing these artificial boundaries.
Absolutely, but we're Africans, right? And my role and responsibility is to make sure that we have equitable development on our continent. Interestingly, if you take a look at my career, I spent probably about 95% of my career outside of Nigeria.
You are an African.
Yes.
Yeah, you have
in different countries, right? From francophone countries to small countries, large countries. And so, as president of the bank, I'm president for all, right? And the issue that affects a small country like Comoros affects me. Sao Tome affects me. What happens in Cape Verde affects me. So that's where I'm there, right? And I think the most important thing I can say is you just feel humbled to be given the responsibility to help to lead Africa's premier development finance institution, to meet the hopes and aspirations of a continent. And I think it's a continent that is a very hopeful continent. It's a continent that is thriving. Despite its challenges, I think it's a resilient continent. And I want to have a continent that is able to provide a lot of better economic opportunities. People always tell me I'm fast. I think, yes, I say the things that are good for Africa must never always happen in the future. They have to happen now.
Very interesting. I have to say, President Adesina, it was a pleasure to have you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you so very much, Shaka.
You're most welcome,
keep up your great job. Thank you for what you're doing for Africa.
The feeling is mutual.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Thank you too, sir. Very good.